Okay, so far we've added intervals assuming a fifth was a fifth was a fifth. We didn't distinguish between a perfect, diminished, augmented fifth. What we said about one applied to the other. But sometimes, as when we will discuss the guitar, for instance, which chords are playable, we're going to do that for the violin first, but we are eventually going to reach the guitar. A chord might be playable only if a certain interval is not augmented, etc. So we need to be mindful of chromaticism, alterations, etc. So things like that. How would you compute the following? So far we haven't discussed how to do that. Among the intervals from a unison to a seventh, we call strong intervals. The unison to the third, like unison, second, and third, are the strong intervals, and the weak intervals are all the other intervals. So the ones between a fourth and a seventh are weak intervals. We call the first three strong because they're not missing the semitone that the ones that come after are missing. If you imagine the piano, there's a black note that's skipped between a third and a fourth. In a sense, we can say that weak intervals behave a bit like diminished intervals when added to other intervals. They're a bit like diminished intervals or weak intervals, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, and the seventh. Okay. And now let's notice how we add intervals from a unison to a seventh to get a sum between a unison and a seventh. Here are all the sums. Do you notice a pattern? Is there a way to predict when we have to diminish or augment the result we would have gotten with the chromaticism-free system? Remember how we add things? You look at the smallest number. If you're adding two intervals, you look for the smallest of the two intervals. You reduce it by one, and then you just add them. How can we predict when we have to diminish or augment the result we would have gotten with the chromaticism-free system the normal way? Well, here's a pattern. We can follow our usual system, adding the two numbers as if we were not concerned about chromaticism. And whenever we add two strong intervals, either we get a strong interval or we get an augmented weak interval. When we add two weak intervals, we get a diminished interval. When we add a weak interval to a strong interval, that is two intervals of different type, no change is needed. So that's a pattern. Strong plus strong, you see? Strong interval plus strong interval is either strong interval or augmented weak interval. Weak plus weak is a diminished interval. And a weak plus strong or strong plus weak, doesn't really matter the order, is going to, no change is needed if they're intervals of different type. From these rules you can deduce how to subtract an interval from a longer interval if the longest one is at most a seventh. I wrote them down, but really you don't have to remember these rules. Just think backwards as you subtract. Later on we're going to do a couple, in a few moments we're going to do a couple negative intervals and subtractions, and we're going to think in these terms, and then we will do it by thinking backwards. It's easier to just think backwards. It's something you could do mentally. So strong minus strong is going to be strong, since the only way you could have gotten a strong was, with another strong. So if you're going to have you start out with a strong and you subtract a strong, you need to get a strong. Of course, we're restricting ourselves to intervals between a unison and a seventh when we say that. Strong minus weak, a strong interval minus a weak interval. It's not going to happen in our situation, because we're restricting ourselves to a unison to a seventh, So it doesn't happen here because the strong intervals are shorter than the weak intervals. After all, we're always restricting ourselves to intervals between a unison and a seventh. Of course, you can have negative intervals, and in such a case, you can rewrite the intervals with a minus sign in front, and it will be reduced to a weak interval minus a strong interval. We'll see examples of that. Don't worry about the strong minus weak. It's not going to happen. And again, and in fact, you don't have to worry about any of these subtractions. You could deduce everything from addition, which you could do, by the way, with normal numbers when you're adding two numbers. If you're doing 9 minus 4, you could just, you don't, in fact, I don't remember really memorizing a subtraction table. Well, I'm not sure. And, you just know that 9 minus 4, you're thinking, well, you have to add 5 to 4 to get 9. You're thinking backwards. And you could do that with this system. You don't have to be memorizing subtractions, So weak minus strong is a weak or diminished strong. Because a weak interval either results from a strong added to a weak. If a strong was added to the strong, the weak interval would have augmented, doesn't need modification. And if you add a strong to another strong, you don't have to memorize all this stuff. You could just think backwards. We will do it soon. We'll do both ways. Similarly, weak minus weak is strong or augmented weak. Again, I'm writing the rules down, but just think backwards. If you had to augment something, then you'll have to diminish the things that add to it, which is diminishing one of the things adding to it if it isn't already augmented. Think backwards. No need to memorize these rules. Like if you are, if the interval would normally be augmented and you don't see it augmented, then in order to get that, you have to diminish one of the intervals you started out with. If you're adding two intervals, you're getting something else, and the results of, like, you're adding two strongs, and if you're supposed to get something that was augmented, if you're doing a subtraction, a strong minus some other, a weak minus a strong, you would have had to augment the weak, and if the weak's not augmented, then you have to diminish the result in order to weaken it, so to speak, so that it, to justify it not being augmented, so to speak, But anyway, just think backwards. No need to memorize these rules. Okay, now, how do we add intervals that sum up to a seventh using our non-chromatic system of adding? First, compute the sum the usual way, as if you didn't care about chromaticism. Then modify the sum following the strong weak interval rules. Okay, now, here are a couple examples. For the first sum, the third is a strong interval. The fourth is a weak interval, so no modification is needed. All these examples right here have addition. There's no subtraction. We're going to do subtraction soon. No modification needed. For the second sum, since we add two strong intervals and got a weak interval, we need to augment the sum. So second plus third is augmented fourth. You see, strong plus strong is either strong or augmented weak. And, a fourth is a weak interval, so we have to augment it. For the third sum, note that we use a property of the modifiers to compute the sum. Sometimes we're using the properties. That's why we needed to know the properties of the modifiers, Since we added a weak interval to a strong interval, no modification is needed. So in this case, a weak interval plus a strong interval is we're not supposed to, we don't modify that, so there's no modification needed. For the fourth sum, we again use the properties of modifiers to compute the sum. This time we added two strong intervals and got a weak interval. We need to augment the interval, so a diminished third plus a second is an augmented diminished fourth. And remember, the augmented and the diminished cancel out, so we get a fourth. So a diminished third plus a second is a fourth. We just use one of the properties again. Note that the augmented modifier cancel out the diminished modifier, as I just said. Okay, for the before last sum, we again use the properties of the modifiers to compute the sum. This time we added two weak intervals, so we need to diminish the result. We can rewrite a double diminished chord as a sixth. Okay? And for the last sum, we can't compute it yet because the sum is larger than a seventh. The result happens to be a ninth. And you can see how that not being a diminished, that's not being a diminished interval doesn't follow our rule. We need to remember that we are restricting ourselves to sums up to a seventh. That's going to be important later. We can't, these rules apply to sums that reach up to a seventh. Okay. With the same knowledge, we can easily do subtractions from intervals up to a seventh. For the first example, weak minus weak is strong or augmented weak, so no modification. For the second example, weak minus weak is strong or augmented weak. So we augment. In the third example, we can write it as a sum of intervals. Just put a negative sign in front of it. Remember, we don't modify when we add a strong interval to a weak one. For the fourth example, weak minus strong is weak or diminished strong, so we diminish. For the last example, we have not yet explained how to deal with sums larger than a seventh, but we will soon discover how to add them. But still, note how we converted the negative intervals into a sum of positive intervals. Okay, and remember I told you it's easier to just think backwards than to memorize what you get when you do a weak minus a strong and all that stuff. And again, it's very easy to remember the addition rules. Strong plus strong, is a strong or an augmented weak. It's like you strengthen the weak. And strong plus weak, no modification. And weak plus weak is diminished. It's very easy to see that. It's much easier, as I said, to just think backwards. Here's how to do it with those same examples we just went through. You just need to gather the smallest numbers you see, put them on the same side, so to speak, in a way that makes them positive, so to speak, the way you do with normal arithmetic or algebra. In the first example, the smallest numbers we see are the 2 and the 4. So gather the second and the fourth on the same side of the equation, so to speak. To get something positive, you get second plus fourth, which is a strong interval plus a weak interval, so no modification necessary since the fifth isn't modified. And the fifth, isn't modified, so all is well, we don't have to change anything. If it was augmented, we would need to adjust, the interval. If we had an augmented fifth, we'd have to augment the second or the fourth in order to get that augmented fifth, In the second example, the smallest numbers we see are 2/4. Gather them on the same side, you get fourth plus fourth. That's a weak plus weak, which gives us a diminished interval. Since the seventh is not diminished, it is that diminished seventh interval augmented. That's what it is. It's like we were supposed to get something, and what we're getting instead is the augmented. Is that what we're supposed to get augmented? The diminished seventh is now augmented. It's just a seventh. So we have to augment the answer we got. So the answer is an augmented fourth, It's an augmented fourth. And note that the fourth plus augmented fourth is a seventh, So, when you add them, you get an augmented fourth. In the third example, the fifth, 5 and 3 are the smallest numbers. They're already on the same side. Putting on the same side in order to get a positive interval, we get fifth plus third, which is a weak plus strong. And it doesn't require any modification. And since the seventh is not modified, all is well. We don't have to change anything. In the fourth example, the smallest numbers are the 2 and the 3. Putting them on the same side, in a way that to get positive intervals, we get second plus third. We get the second plus third, that is a strong plus strong. That's either a strong or augmented weak. Since the fourth is weak and is not augmented when the answer needs to be augmented, it is a diminished version of what it was supposed to be. We have something that is diminished version of what we're supposed to get. In order to get that diminished version, we need to diminish the answer we got. So the answer is a diminished second. We have to diminish it because what we have for the fourth is a diminished version of what we're supposed to get, which was the augmented fourth. Note that if we diminish the negative interval, it would be augmenting the positive part. As we saw in the properties, it is a second itself, not the negative second that we need to diminish. You can't just diminish negative second. That would give you, if you did that, that would be like a minus augmented second. Remember the property video. In the fifth example, the sum is too big. Remember, we're only dealing with sums whose results are at most a seventh. And remember, you don't have to go through all these steps. You can do this automatically by thinking backwards about this, the way you no doubt do when you're dealing with arithmetic or algebra. When you do 13 minus 7, I'm sure you're not thinking about, putting things on the same side. You just immediately, without really thinking about it, 13 minus 7, you're thinking 6 plus 7 is 13. The 6 seems to just pop up. You don't have to really go through all these steps, but I'm showing the mental, the gymnastics that you might do to see what the answer is when you see one of these things. But it's when you do 14 minus 5, I'm sure you're not thinking, I mean, maybe you do the arithmetic, but you could also automatically think 14 minus 5. You're thinking 9 plus 5 equals 14, and you already know the answer because you know the addition. You know how addition works, so you're automatically thinking about addition for subtraction. You don't have to, yeah. Anyway, next time we'll see how we can add to an octave. Then we're going to combine what we just learned with that knowledge, how we could add things up to an octave, like how we're going to add intervals that are from a unison to a seventh together to get an octave. And when we're going to combine our knowledge of summing up to the seventh and adding to an eighth in order to add any two intervals, and not any number of intervals, not just two, when we care about chromaticism. And as usual, please like and subscribe, and see you next time.